Our goal is still to find the values of trig functions, and there's a way that we can make our lives a little bit easier by thinking about odd and even principles. So an even principle, or sorry, an even function is where you put a number in and it's the same output as if you put the opposite of the number in. So for example, f of x equals x squared. If you put in 2, you get 4. If you put in -2, you also get 4. So that's an example of an even function. And it turns out that cosine and secant are also even. So let's see. Oh, here, we'll go ahead and start with cosine. I'll just start on b. All right, so if I was at a positive pi over 6, that is square root of 3 over 2 and 1/2. So the cosine of pi over 6 is the x value. So it would be square root of 3 over 2. But notice if we do the cosine of negative pi over 6, because cosine is all about the x value, the x value on both of these points is still positive square root of 3 over 2. It's just the y that's negative down in quadrant 4. So the cosine is also square root of 3 over 2. Okay, so that's an example showing that cosine is even. Okay, you put in the opposite. Let's see, cosine of pi over 6 and cosine of negative pi over 6, and they are the same output. Okay, so that is square root of 3 over 2, and we're done. But let's look what happens with sine. Because sine is about the y, those are not the same output. Okay, so that is what we call an odd function, where this is going to be the opposite of sine of pi over 6. And so that is a negative 1/2. It just makes our lives a tiny bit easier as we find values of trig functions. That's always our goal. And so if we've memorized, our key ones in quadrant 1, and then we know how to rewrite if we have negative t values, we can just use what we know about quadrant 1. All right, now let's think about tangent. Tangent is y over x. And so in this case, tangent of pi over 6 would be a positive 1, but here, oops, sorry, not 1, but square root of 3 over 3, and this one, tangent of pi over 6, is a negative square root of 3 over 3. So this is an odd function, tangent of pi root of 6, so it is the opposite of what we would get tangent of pi over 6. In example 5, we need to determine if this function is odd, even, or neither. And just a little note on notation. If I want to show that I have the cosine of x and I'm taking and squaring that whole quantity, the way that we write that so that we don't get confused is actually cosine with the little 2, the squaring is up above the s. Okay, but let me just show you why, because if we have here, it's just confusing if you write it this way, where you have cosine of x squared. What that actually means is that the only thing being squared is just the x squared. Okay, so we don't want to show that. We want to show that the whole entire quantity of cosine x, that whole thing, is being squared. Okay, so that's just the convention. We're just going to put that 2 right over the, actually I don't like that color. Yeah, just put it right there between the cosine and the x. And that just means quantity cosine of x, quantity squared. Okay, so is this odd, even, or neither? Well, let's just go in and investigate what happens if I put the opposite of x in there. Okay, so plugging that in, I would take sine of the opposite of x times cosine of the opposite of x, and I'm just going to write that whole thing, that whole quantity, as being squared. Okay, now sine, that is a odd function, so sine of opposite of x would be the opposite of sine of x. Now cosine, that is an even function, so cosine of x is the same thing as cosine of the opposite of x. Okay, so we'd have sine of x times x times cosine quantity squared of x. Well, that's not even, right? Because to be even, we need the output and the input to be the same, or sorry, the output to be the same when you put in an x or the opposite of x. Okay, so it's certainly not even. Let's just see if it's odd. Let's just see what happens if we take the opposite of the function. So our function is sine of x times cosine squared of x. And the opposite of that, that would just make the whole thing negative, sine of x. And that is the same as f of the opposite of x. Okay, so because the opposite of f of x is equal to f of the opposite of x, that means the function is odd.